Uma produção WGBH Boston associada a Harvard University. Qual a coisa certa a fazer? Justice, com Michael Sandel.
Last time, we began to discuss Locke's state of nature, his account of private property, his theory of legitimate government, which is government based on consent and also limited government. Locke believes in certain fundamental rights that constrain what government can do, and he believes that those rights are natural rights, not rights that flow from law or from government. And so Locke's great philosophical experiment is to see if he can give an account of how there could be a right to private property without consent before government and legislators arrive on the scene to define property. That's his question. That's his claim. There is a way, Locke argues, to create property, not just in the things we gather and hunt, but in the land itself. Provided there is enough and is good left for others. Today I want to turn to the question of consent, which is Locke's second big idea. Private property is one, consent is the other. What is the work of consent? People here have been invoking the idea of consent since we began, since the first week. You remember when we were talking about pushing the fat man off the bridge, someone said, but he didn't agree to sacrifice himself. It would be different if he consented. Or when we were talking about the cabin boy, killing and eating the cabin boy, some people said, well, if they had consented to a lottery, it would be different. Then it would be all right. So consent has come up a lot. And here in John Locke, we have one of the great philosophers of consent. Consent is an obvious, familiar idea in moral and political philosophy. Locke says that legitimate government is government founded on consent, and who nowadays would disagree with him? Sometimes when the ideas of political philosophers are as familiar as Locke's ideas about consent, it's hard to make sense of them, or at least to find them very interesting. But there are some puzzles, some strange features of Locke's account of consent as the basis of legitimate government. And that's what I'd like to take up today. One way of testing the plausibility of Locke's idea of consent, and also of probing some of its perplexities, is to ask just what a legitimate government founded on consent can do. What are its powers according to Locke? Well, in order to answer that question, it helps to remember what the state of nature is like. Remember, the state of nature is the condition that we decide to leave, and that's what gives rise to consent. Why not stay there? Why bother with government at all? Well, what's Locke's answer to that question? He says there are some inconveniences in the state of nature, but what are those inconveniences? The main inconvenience is that everyone can enforce the law of nature. Everyone is an enforcer, or what Locke calls the executor of the state of nature. And he means executor literally. If someone violates the law of nature, he's an aggressor, he's beyond reason, and you can punish him. And you don't have to be too careful or fine about gradations of punishment in the state of nature. You can kill him. You can certainly kill someone who comes after you. tries to murder you, that's self-defense. But the enforcement power, the right to punish, everyone can do the punishing in the state of nature. And not only can you punish with death people who come after you, seeking to take your life, you can also punish a thief who tries to steal your goods, because that also counts as aggression against the law of nature. If someone has stolen from a third party, you can go after him. Why is this? Well, violations of the law of nature are an act of aggression. There is no police force, there are no judges, no juries. So everyone is the judge in his or her own case. And Locke observes that when people are the judges of their own cases, they tend to get carried away. And this gives rise to the inconvenience in the state of nature. People overshoot the mark, there's aggression, there's punishment, and before you know it, everybody is insecure in the enjoyment of his or her unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, he describes in pretty harsh and even grim terms what you can do to people who violate the law of nature. One may destroy a man who makes war upon him for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion. Such men have no other rule but that of force and violence. Listen to this. And so may be treated as beasts of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy you if you fall into their power. So kill them first. So what starts out as a seemingly benign state of nature where everyone's free and yet where there is a law and the law respects people's rights and those rights are so powerful that they're unalienable, what starts out looking very benign, once you look closer, is pretty fierce and filled with violence, and that's why people want to leave. How do they leave? Well, here's where consent comes in. The only way to escape from the state of nature is to undertake an act of consent where you agree to give up the enforcement power and to create a government or a community where there will be a legislature to make law and where everyone agrees in advance, everyone who enters agrees in advance to abide by whatever the majority decides. But then the question, and this is our question, and here's where I want to get your views, then the question is, what powers, what can the majority decide? Now here it gets tricky for Locke, because you remember, alongside the whole story about consent and majority rule, there are these natural rights, the law of nature, these unalienable rights. And you remember, they don't disappear when people join together to create a civil society. So even once the majority is in charge, the majority can't violate your inalienable rights, can't violate your fundamental right to life, liberty, and property. So here's the puzzle. How much power does the majority have? How limited is the government created by consent? It's limited by the obligation on the part of the majority to respect and to enforce the fundamental natural rights of the citizens. They don't give those up. We don't give those up when we enter government. That's this powerful idea taken over from Locke by Jefferson in the Declaration. Unalienable rights. So, let's go to our two cases. Remember Michael Jordan, Bill Gates, the libertarian objection to taxation for redistribution. Well, what about Locke's limited government? Is there anyone who thinks that Locke does give grounds for opposing taxation for redistribution? Anybody? Go ahead.
If the majority rules that there should be taxation, even if the minority should still not have to be taxed, because that's taking away property, which is one of the rights of nature.
All right, so, and what's your name? Ben. So, if the majority taxes the minority without the consent of the minority to that particular tax law, it does amount to a taking of their property without their consent, and it would seem that Locke should object to that. Do you want some textual support for your view, for your reading of Locke, Ben? All right. I brought some along just in case you raised it. If you have your texts, look at 138, passage 138. The supreme power, by which Locke means the legislature, cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that people should have property. That was the whole reason for entering society in the first place, to protect the right to property. And when Locke speaks about the right to property, he often uses that as a kind of global term for the whole category, the right to life, liberty, and property. So that part of Locke, at beginning of 138, seems to support Ben's reading. But what about the part of 138, if you keep reading? Men, therefore, in society having property, they have such a right to the goods which by the law of the community are theirs. Look at this. And that no one can take from them without their consent. And then at the end of this passage, he says, so it's a mistake to think that the legislative power can do what it will and dispose of the estates of the subject arbitrarily or take any part of them at pleasure. Here's what's elusive. On the one hand, he says, the government can't take your property without your consent. He's clear about that. But then he goes on to say, I mean, that's the natural right to property. But then it seems that property, what counts as property, is not natural but conventional, defined by the government. The goods which by the law of the community are theirs. And the plot thickens if you look ahead to section 140. In 140, he says governments can't be supported without great charge. Government is expensive. And it's fit that everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate. And then here's the crucial line. But still it must be with his own consent, i.e. the consent of the majority, giving it either by themselves or through their representatives. So what is Locke actually saying? Property is natural in one sense, but conventional in another. It's natural in the sense that we have a fundamental, unalienable right that there be property, that the institution of property exist and be respected by the government. So an arbitrary taking of property would be a violation of the law of nature and would be illegitimate. But it's a further question, here's the conventional aspect of property, it's a further question what counts as property, how it's defined, and what counts as taking property, and that's up to the government. So the consent, here we're coming back to our question, what is the work of consent? What it takes for taxation to be legitimate is that it be by consent not the consent of Bill Gates himself if he's the one who has to pay the tax, but by the consent that he and we, all of us within the society, gave when we emerged from the state of nature and created the government in the first place. It's the collective consent. And by that reading, it looks like consent is doing a whole lot, and the limited government consent creates isn't all that limited. Does anyone want to respond to that or have a question about that? Go ahead. Stand up.
Well, I'm just wondering what Locke's view is on, once you have a government that's already in place, whether it is possible for people who are born into that government to then leave and return to the state of nature. I mean, I don't think that Locke mentioned that at all in the...
What do you think?
Well, I think as the convention, it would be very difficult to leave the government because you are no longer... because nobody else is just living in the state of nature, everybody else is now governed by this legislature.
What would it mean today, you're asking? And what's your name?
Well, Nicola.
Nicola, to leave the state, suppose you wanted to leave civil society today, you want to withdraw your consent and return to the state of nature.
Well, because you didn't actually consent to it, you were just born into it. It was
okay.
Your ancestors who joined.
Right.
So.
You didn't sign the social contract. I didn't sign it.
Exactly.
All right, so what does Locke say there? Yeah.
I don't think Locke says that you have to sign anything. I think that he says that it's kind of implied consent. By living and taking government services, you are implying that you're consenting to the government taking things from you.
All right, so implied consent, that's a partial answer to this challenge. Now, you may not think that implied consent is as good as the real thing. Is that what you're shaking your head about, Nikolai? Speak up. Stand up and speak up.
I don't think that necessarily just by utilizing the government's various resources that we are necessarily implying that we agree with the way that this government was formed, or that we have consented to actually join into the social contract.
So you don't think the idea of implied consent is strong enough to generate any obligation at all to obey the government?
Not necessarily, no.
Nikolai, if you didn't think you'd get caught, would you pay your taxes?
I don't think so. I would rather have a system, personally, that I could give money to exactly those sections of the government that I support and not just blanket support everything.
You'd rather be in the state of nature, at least
exactly.
On April 15th. But what I'm trying to get at is, do you consider that you're under no obligation, since you haven't actually entered into any act of consent, but for prudential reasons you do what you're supposed to do according to the law?
Exactly.
If you look at it that way, then you're violating another one of Locke's treatises, which is that you can't take anything from anyone else. Like you can't take the government services and then not give them anything in return. If you want to go live in the state of nature, that's fine, but you can't take anything for the government, because by the government's terms, which are the only terms under which you can enter the agreement, say that you have to pay taxes to take those things.
So you're saying that Nicola can go back into the state of nature if she wants to, but she can't drive on Mass Ave.
Exactly.
Right.
I want to raise the stakes beyond using Mass Ave,
Yes.
and even beyond taxation. What about life? What about military conscription? Yes. What do you say? Stand up.
First of all, we have to remember that sending people to war is not necessarily implying that they'll die. I mean, obviously, you're not raising their chances here, but it's not a death penalty. So if you're going to discuss whether or not military conscriptions is equivalent to, suppressing people's right to life, you shouldn't approach it that way. Secondly, the real problem here is Locke has this view about consent and natural rights. But you're not allowed to give up your natural rights either. So the real question is, how does he himself figure it out between, I agree to give up my life, give up my property when he talks about taxes or military conscription for the fact, but I guess Locke would be against suicide. And that's still, my own consent. I agree.
Good. All right. What's your
life.
name?
Eric.
So Eric brings us back to the puzzle we've been wrestling with since we started reading Locke. On the one hand, we have these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, which means that even we don't have the power to give them up. And that's what creates the limits on legitimate government. It's not what we consent to that limits government. It's what we lack the power to give away when we consent that limits government. That's the point at the heart of Locke's whole account of legitimate government. But now you say, well, if we can't give up our own life, if we can't commit suicide, if we can't give up our right to property, how can we then agree to be bound by a majority that will force us to sacrifice our lives or give up our property? Does Locke have a way out of this? Or is he basically sanctioning an all-powerful government, despite everything he says about unalienable rights? Does he have a way out of it? Who would speak here in defense of Locke or make sense, find a way out of this predicament? All right, go ahead.
I feel like there's a general distinction to be made between the right to life that individuals possess and the fact that a government cannot take away a single individual's right to life. I think if you look at conscription as the government picking out certain individuals to go fight in war, then that would be a violation of their rights, their natural right to life. On the other hand, if you have conscription or let's say a lottery, for example, then in that case, I would view that as the population picking their representatives to defend them in the case of war. The idea being that since the whole population cannot go out there to defend its own right to property, it picks its own representatives through a process that's essentially random. And then these sort of elected representatives go out and fight for the rights of the people. It works very similar. It works just like an elected government, in my opinion.
All right, so an elected government can conscript citizens to go out and defend the way of life, the community that makes the enjoyment of rights possible?
I think it can, because to me it seems that it's very similar to the process of electing representatives to a legislature.
Although here, it's as if the government is electing by conscription certain citizens to go die for the sake of the whole. Is that consistent with respect for a natural right to liberty?
Well, what I would say there's a distinction between picking out individuals and having a random choice of individuals.
Like picking out, let me make sure, between picking out individuals.
Well,
right, what's your name?
Gokul.
Gopal says there's a difference between picking out individuals to lay down their lives and having a general law. I think this is the answer Locke would give, actually, Gopal. Locke is against arbitrary government. He's against the arbitrary taking, the singling out of Bill Gates to finance the war in Iraq. He's against singling out a particular citizen or group of people to go off and fight. But if there's a general law such that the government's choice, the majority's action, is non-arbitrary, it doesn't really amount to a violation of people's basic rights. What does count as a violation is an arbitrary taking, because that would essentially say, not only to Bill Gates, but to everyone, there is no rule of law. There is no institution of property, because at the whim of the king, or for that matter of the parliament, we can name you or you to give up your property or to give up your life. But so long as there is a non-arbitrary rule of law, then it's permissible. Now, you may say this doesn't amount to a very limited government. And the libertarian may complain that Locke is not such a terrific ally after all. The libertarian has two grounds for disappointment in Locke. First, that the rights are unalienable, and therefore I don't really own myself after all. I can't dispose of my life or my liberty or my property in a way that violates my rights. That's disappointment number one. Disappointment number two, once there's a legitimate government based on consent, the only limits for Locke are limits on arbitrary takings of life or of liberty or of property. But if the majority decides, if the majority promulgates a generally applicable law, and if it votes duly according to fair procedures, then there is no violation, whether it's a system of taxation or a system of conscription. So it's clear that Locke is worried about the absolute arbitrary power of kings, but it's also true, and here's the darker side of Locke, that this great theorist of consent came up with a theory of private property that didn't require consent, that may, and this goes back to the point Rochelle made last time, may have had something to do with Locke's second concern, which was America. You remember when he talks about the state of nature, he's not talking about an imaginary place. In the beginning, he says, all the world was America. And what was going on in America? The settlers were enclosing land and engaged in wars with the Native Americans. Locke, who was an administrator of one of the colonies, may have been as interested in providing a justification for private property through enclosure without consent, through enclosure and cultivation, as he was with developing a theory of government based on consent that would rein in kings and arbitrary rulers. The question we're left with, the fundamental question we still haven't answered is, what then becomes of consent? What work can it do? What is its moral force? What are the limits of consent? Consent matters not only for governments, but also for markets. And beginning next time, we're going to take up questions of the limits of consent in the buying and selling of goods.